Red light filled the bridge before anyone said a word. I was standing behind the command chair when the alarms tore through the quiet of the meridian, and every screen around me turned the same angry color at once. My name is Ezra Voss, captain of Earth's first true warship, and in that moment I felt my chest go tight in a way training never prepares you for. Unknown fleet, bearing 040, closing fast, said Lucy Bennett, my sensor officer, her voice clipped and steady, despite the fear I could see behind her eyes. How many ships? I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. Sir, I'm counting 40. No, 43. They just came out of nowhere. 43 ships. Earth had never faced a fleet that size. We had 12 vessels defending the entire system, and most of those were still finishing their trials. A transmission opened on its own, forcing its way through our communication systems like it had no interest in asking permission. The voice that came through was flat, mechanical, and utterly without warmth. Submit or be cleansed. That was it. No introduction. No demand. Just 5 words repeated over and over on every channel we had. I gripped the edge of my chair and looked at the tactical display glowing in front of me. The alien fleet was already crossing the orbit of our outer planets, moving with a confidence that told me they expected no real resistance. They called themselves the Thren Ascendancy, though we had only learned that name a few hours earlier from a frightened diplomatic packet forwarded by the Galactic Council. Earth had joined that council 18 months ago, the newest and smallest member of a community that stretched across thousands of star systems. We were the outsiders, the primitive species everyone politely tolerated but never quite trusted. And now, somewhere far beyond our solar system, in a chamber none of us had ever seen, I knew the other council members were watching this unfold on their monitors, waiting to see how quickly humanity would fall. "Captain, orders," said Daniel Ashford, my second in command, standing to my right with his hand resting on the console like he needed something solid to hold on to. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing through every possible outcome, and none of them looked good on paper. 43 ships against 12. A species with centuries of conquest behind them, against a species that had only just discovered how to build a warp drive. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to say, back when I was young and scared of things much smaller than alien invasions. He said humanity never waited to feel ready before it did what needed to be done. We simply did it, and figured out the rest along the way. "Bring all ships to combat stations," I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know I still had. "Launch the defense drones. Full power to shields." "Sir, we're outnumbered nearly 4-1, Lucy said. Not in protest, just in honesty. "I'm aware," I answered. "That's never stopped us before." Across the system, alarms were sounding in cities that had never known war on this scale. Families were being moved to shelters, children were being told to stay calm while adults tried not to show their own fear. I thought about my sister, still living outside Denver, probably watching the news feeds right now, wondering if her brother would come home. The alien fleet continued its approach, and I studied their formation on the display. It was rigid, mathematical, almost beautiful in its precision. These were beings who had done this many times before. Conquest was not new to them. It was routine. "Captain, I'm picking up additional transmissions," Lucy said. "It's not directed at us. I think it's meant for the Galactic Council." "Play it," I said. The voice that followed was different, smoother, almost amused. "Council observers, you are witnessing the correction of an unstable variable. The species designated Earth has been added to your assembly in error. We will resolve this matter quickly and offer our apologies for any disruption to your proceedings." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They weren't just attacking us. They were performing for an audience, showing the rest of the galaxy exactly what happened to species who dared to sit at the table before they understood their place. "They think this will be easy," Daniel said quietly. "Let them think that," I said. "Thinking something is easy and it actually being easy are very different things." I ordered the fleet into a defensive line, just beyond the orbit of Mars, using the planet itself as partial cover from long-range sensors. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was ours, built from months of simulations run by officers who had studied every war Earth had ever fought and tried to imagine what an alien one might look like. The Thren fleet crossed the halfway point, and their weapons began to charge. I could see the energy signatures building on our sensors, brilliant and terrifying, more powerful than anything human engineers had built. "They're not slowing down," Lucy said. "They're not even trying to negotiate." "Would you, if you were this confident?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. I thought about the council delegates far away, alien beings from 100 different worlds, gathered in some grand chamber to watch what they likely believed would be a short and one-sided conflict. I imagined their expressions, whatever expressions their unfamiliar faces could make, as they prepared to witness the quiet extinction of humanity's dream of belonging among the stars. But there was something they didn't know about us yet, something none of the Council's careful reports could have captured, because it wasn't written in any database or diplomatic file. It lived in something harder to measure, a stubbornness, a refusal to accept the ending other people had already written for us. "Captain, they're entering effective weapons range," Daniel said. I stood a little straighter, feeling the old fear settle into something more useful, something closer to focus. "All ships," I said, opening a channel to the entire defense fleet. "This is Captain Voss. I know the numbers aren't in our favor. I know what's coming toward us looks impossible to stop, but we didn't build this fleet, this system, this whole civilization by waiting for good odds. We built it by refusing to lose, even when losing seemed certain." I paused, looking at the wall of enemy ships glowing on the display, close enough now that I could see individual vessel signatures breaking away from the main formation, arranging into an attack pattern. "Hold formation," I said. "Wait for my signal." Somewhere out there, the Galactic Council was watching, expecting to see the quiet, inevitable defeat of a species too young and too small to matter. They had no idea what was about to happen. The first shots came from the Thren fleet, brilliant streaks of energy crossing the black distance between their ships and ours, and for one long second, everything seemed to slow down, like the universe itself was holding its breath to see what humanity would do next. Then our ships answered back, and the true battle for Earth began. Far beyond our solar system, in the quiet chamber of the Galactic Council, alien delegates leaned forward in their seats, their earlier confidence beginning to waver as they watched the first exchange unfold. None of them expected what the data streams were about to show them. None of them were ready for humanity. To understand how we got to that moment, floating in the dark with 43 alien ships bearing down on us, you have to go back 18 months, to the day Earth first stepped onto the galactic stage. I remember sitting in a briefing room with a dozen other officers, listening to a translated recording from the Galactic Council for the very first time. A calm, measured voice welcomed humanity as a new member species, describing us in careful, clinical language. Promising, emotional, disorganized, young. None of it was said with cruelty. It was simply how the Council saw us, based on centuries of data collected from 1,000 other worlds. Most species who joined the Council arrived slowly, carefully, guided by more advanced neighbors who taught them the rules before they ever had to face a real threat. Earth arrived differently. We stumbled onto faster-than-light travel almost by accident, following decades of quiet research that suddenly broke through in a single breakthrough year. One day we were a species confined to our own solar system, and the next, we were picking up transmissions from worlds we never knew existed. The Council welcomed us with polite curiosity, the same way a large family might welcome a distant, unfamiliar cousin to a holiday dinner. They gave us maps, translation tools, invitations to join trade routes and cultural exchanges. What they didn't offer was protection, because protection is something you earn through influence, and Earth had none. I was part of a small group of officers assigned to something called the Soul Defense Initiative, a project most of the Council barely noticed. On paper, it looked like a modest effort by a new member species to build basic patrol ships. In reality, it was something else entirely. Grace Whitfield led that project. She had spent 20 years studying human history before the stars ever opened up to us, and she understood something that most of the newly arrived alien diplomats never bothered to ask about. She understood how humanity behaved when it felt threatened. "They think we're gentle because we smile a lot and apologize too much," she told us during one of our early meetings. "They haven't read our history books." Grace pulled up old records from Earth's own past, conflicts fought long before any of us had been born, wars that reshaped continents and cost millions of lives. She showed us how quickly human industry could shift from building cars and appliances to building tanks and aircraft, how fast entire nations could reorganize themselves around a single purpose when survival was on the line. "If something ever comes for Earth," she said, "it won't be facing a peaceful, disorganized species. It will be facing a species that has done this before and learned from every mistake it ever made." At the time, it felt like theory, a cautionary story meant to keep us motivated during long nights of engineering work. None of us truly believed an alien fleet would ever test that theory in our lifetime. But Grace insisted we prepare anyway, and the Council, distracted by larger political matters across their vast territory, largely ignored what Earth was quietly building in the shadow of the Moon. Lunar shipyards rose within months, hidden partly by the simple fact that no one else in the galaxy considered Earth important enough to watch closely. We recruited engineers, pilots, and strategists from every corner of the planet, blending old military doctrine with newly acquired alien technology purchased through legal trade channels. I remember standing on an observation deck with Daniel Ashford, watching the skeleton of our first true warship take shape against the black backdrop of space. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much that needed saying. We both understood what we were building, even if neither of us wanted to admit why. Grace often reminded us that human warfare had always evolved through pressure, not comfort. Nations that felt safe rarely innovated quickly. Nations that felt threatened built entire new industries within years instead of decades. She believed humanity's history of conflict, as painful as it was, had also given us something few other species possessed: the ability to adapt violence into structure, chaos into strategy, panic into planning. "The Council thinks warfare is a last resort for civilized species," she said once, during a late-night briefing most of us barely stayed awake for. "For humans, it's a language we've never fully stopped speaking, even during our longest periods of peace." None of the other Council delegations seemed to notice how quickly Earth's technology sector pivoted. Alien economists reviewing our trade data assumed the sudden demand for rare materials was tied to infrastructure projects, not to shipbuilding. Diplomats visiting Earth toured carefully arranged cities, admiring our art, our music, our architecture, never once suspecting that beneath the surface, an entire planet was quietly preparing for a war it hoped would never come. I think part of what protected us during those early months was simple underestimation. The Council had built its models of new species based on centuries of gentle, cooperative civilizations who joined their community slowly and predictably. Humanity didn't fit that pattern, and instead of raising alarms, our unpredictability was simply logged as a curiosity, an interesting footnote in an otherwise unremarkable species profile. Peter Lindquist, one of our lead engineers, used to joke that the galaxy's biggest mistake was assuming a species could be measured accurately after only 18 months of contact. "They've read our poetry," he said once, "but they haven't read our history, and our history is the only part of us that actually matters right now." As the months passed, our fleet grew from a handful of prototype vessels into a functioning defense force. We trained relentlessly, running simulations against theoretical alien fleets built from data the Council itself had shared with us during routine diplomatic exchanges. We studied the Thren Ascendancy specifically, a name that appeared only occasionally in Council records, usually attached to reports of smaller species being absorbed or silenced along the outer trade routes. Grace flagged that name early, long before any official warning ever reached Earth. She noticed a pattern in the way the Thren expanded, always targeting newer, smaller council members before they had time to establish strong alliances. It wasn't hard to imagine why Earth might eventually catch their attention. They wait until a species feels safe, she warned us. Then they strike before anyone else can respond. Most of the officers in that room, myself included, hoped her warnings would never be tested. We built our fleet anyway, because hope has never been a strategy, only a comfort. Then, 18 months after Earth's first quiet steps into galactic society, the warning finally came. A distress packet from a neighboring system, followed almost immediately by long-range sensor readings confirming a large fleet crossing into Sol space without any prior communication. I remember Grace's face when the readings came through. She wasn't surprised. She looked almost relieved, in a strange, grim way, like someone who had spent years preparing for a storm, finally seeing dark clouds on the horizon. "They think we're still the species from their old reports," she said quietly. "Emotional, disorganized, unprepared." She looked at me then, her expression steady despite everything unfolding around us. "Let's show them how wrong they are." Far across the galaxy, in the observation halls of the council chamber, alien analysts pulled up their models of Earth's defense capabilities, confident in numbers that were already 18 months out of date. They expected an easy resolution to what they saw as a minor territorial dispute. They had no idea that the very models they trusted were about to fail them completely. The Meridian shuddered under the force of the first impact, and I grabbed the arm of my chair to keep from stumbling as the deck tilted beneath my feet. "Shields at 92%, Lucy called out, her hands moving quickly across her console. "That first hit was stronger than our simulations predicted." "Divert power from non-essential systems," I said. "Keep those shields up as long as possible." Around us, the black expanse of space lit up with streaks of energy weapons crossing between the two fleets, brilliant and silent in the vacuum, terrifying in a way that no simulation had ever fully captured. This was no longer theory. This was no longer a possibility we prepared for during long nights of training. This was real, and every decision I made in the next few minutes could decide whether Earth survived to see another sunrise. "Enemy fleet is adjusting formation," Daniel said. "They're trying to flank us on the left side, near the Ashford line." I studied the display, watching the alien ships shift with practiced precision, clearly following tactics they had used successfully many times before. If this had been a simple battle of numbers and firepower, we would have already lost. But Grace Whitfield had spent months preparing us for exactly this moment, and her voice echoed in my memory now, calm and certain. "Numbers only tell part of the story. The rest depends on what you're willing to do with what you have. Release the decoy drones," I ordered. Dozens of small unmanned vessels launched from our formation, each one broadcasting a false energy signature designed to mimic a full-sized warship. The Thren sensors, built to detect real threats efficiently, struggled to immediately separate the decoys from our actual fleet, and for a few crucial seconds, their formation hesitated. "It's working," Lucy said, a flicker of hope breaking through her focused expression. "Their targeting priorities are scattering." "Now," I said. "Kinetic strike, coordinates locked." Weeks earlier, our engineers had converted a cluster of asteroid mining rigs into makeshift bombardment platforms, using the raw mass of space rock as a weapon far cheaper and far more devastating than traditional energy weapons. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't something the Thren would have expected from a species they considered primitive. The first wave of accelerated debris tore through the disrupted section of the enemy formation, and even from a distance I could see several of their ships losing power, drifting out of position, their shields unable to fully absorb an attack built from something as simple and as ancient as rock and momentum. "Direct hits confirmed," Daniel said, disbelief clear in his voice. 3 enemy vessels disabled. A cheer rose briefly across the bridge, before discipline reasserted itself, officers returning to their stations, aware that the fight was far from over. The Thren fleet adjusted quickly, more quickly than I expected, redirecting their formation to avoid further debris strikes. Their commanders were clearly experienced, unwilling to let a single tactic catch them off guard twice. "Captain, incoming transmission," Lucy said. "It's a direct channel. They want to speak with you." I hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Open it." The voice that came through was calm, almost curious, carrying none of the mechanical coldness of the earlier broadcast. This was a living being speaking directly to me, someone clearly in command of the fleet attacking my home. "You fight with more skill than our reports suggested," the voice said. "I am willing to offer terms. Withdraw your remaining ships, and we will spare your inner worlds from further engagement." I thought about Grace's warnings, about the pattern the Thren had followed with other species, offering brief pauses in battle only to strike harder once resistance weakened. I thought about the millions of people back on Earth, watching this unfold through whatever fragments of information their governments allowed them to see. "Decline," I said simply. There was a short pause before the voice returned, colder this time. "You misunderstand your position." "No," I said. "I think you misunderstand ours." I closed the channel and turned to my crew, feeling something steady settle into my chest, despite the fear still running underneath it. "All ships, advance formation. We're not falling back. We're pushing forward." Daniel looked at me, surprise flashing across his face before it settled into something closer to trust. "Full advance, sir." "Full advance," I confirmed. "They expect us to retreat and regroup. Let's give them something they don't expect instead." Our fleet moved forward, tighter now, weaving between the drifting wreckage left by the kinetic strike, using the debris field itself as partial cover from incoming fire. The Thren ships adjusted again, clearly unsettled by a species that refused to behave according to their expectations. "Captain, enemy formation is splitting," Lucy said. "I think they're trying to reposition around the debris." "Then we don't give them the chance," I said. "Target their central command vessel. Everything we have." Every ship in our fleet redirected their remaining firepower toward the largest Thren vessel, the one broadcasting command signals to the rest of their formation. It was a risk, concentrating our strength on a single target while leaving ourselves more exposed elsewhere, but Grace had taught us something important during our long months of preparation. Break the head, and the body loses its direction. The concentrated barrage tore through the command vessel's shields, energy weapons and kinetic strikes combining in a way the Thren ship's defenses simply weren't built to withstand. Within seconds, its power signature began to flicker, then fail entirely, drifting silently among the wreckage of its own formation. The effect was immediate. Without clear command signals, the remaining Thren ships hesitated, their coordinated formation breaking apart into confused, scattered movements. "Their fleet is losing cohesion," Daniel said, his voice rising with disbelief and something close to hope. "Captain, I think they're actually falling back." I watched the display carefully, half expecting some hidden trick, some final desperate maneuver from a species that clearly hadn't expected to lose so quickly. But the Thren ships continued retreating, regrouping at a safe distance before finally turning away from Sol entirely, vanishing back toward the edge of the system. For a long moment, no one on the bridge said anything. The silence felt strange after the noise and chaos of battle, heavy with disbelief and quiet relief. "We held," Lucy finally said, almost in a whisper. "We actually held." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for hours, my hands finally relaxing their grip on the arm of my chair. Around the system, Earth's cities would soon receive the news. Families would finally exhale, and for the first time since the alarms first sounded, I allowed myself to believe we might actually survive this day. But somewhere far beyond our solar system, I knew this battle was being watched by far more than just our own people. The Galactic Council had seen the entire encounter unfold in real time, and I couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking now, watching a species they had dismissed as primitive drive back an experienced invasion fleet on its very first true encounter. I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that would reshape how the rest of the galaxy saw humanity forever. Far beyond the edges of our solar system, in a chamber built to hold delegates from across the galaxy, the mood had shifted from calm curiosity to something closer to disbelief. I learned about this part later, pieced together from diplomatic reports, translated recordings, and conversations with a few council contacts who had grown surprisingly willing to speak with humanity once the battle ended. What happened in that chamber during our fight for Sol would end up shaping the next chapter of humanity's place among the stars. According to those reports, the council chamber had gathered many of its delegates specifically to observe the Thren fleet's approach toward Earth. Most of them expected a brief, uneventful correction, the kind of minor territorial dispute the Thren had handled many times before with other smaller species. Some delegates had reportedly scheduled other meetings immediately afterward, assuming the entire encounter would be resolved within the hour. Instead, they watched as our decoy drones scattered the Thren's targeting systems. They watched kinetic strikes tear through ships their own historical records considered nearly untouchable. They watched a species barely 18 months into galactic society refuse an offer of terms mid-battle, then respond not with retreat, but with a coordinated advance that broke apart an experienced invasion fleet within a single engagement. Ellen Marsh, a young diplomatic aide stationed temporarily within the Council's observation office, later described the reaction inside the chamber in a private conversation I had with her months afterward. She said the room had gone almost completely silent during the final minutes of the battle, delegates leaning forward in whatever posture their individual physiology allowed, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to concern. It wasn't just that you won, she told me. It was how you won. Your species didn't fight like something desperate or afraid. You fought like something that had already decided the outcome before the battle even started. That observation stuck with me long after our conversation ended, because it echoed almost exactly what Grace Whitfield had always believed about humanity's history. We didn't fight wars hoping to survive them. We fought wars fully intending to end them, on our own terms, regardless of the cost required to get there. The Council convened an emergency session almost immediately after the battle concluded, according to records later shared with Earth's diplomatic office. Delegates debated for hours over what this new information meant for humanity's continued membership, and more importantly, what it meant for the galaxy's broader balance of power. Some delegates apparently pushed for formal sanctions against Earth, framing our tactics as disproportionately aggressive, arguing that our refusal to accept a negotiated retreat mid-battle violated unspoken standards of interstellar conduct. Others pointed out, quite reasonably, that Earth had not initiated the conflict, and had simply defended itself against an unprovoked invasion. A representative from a species called the Doran, longtime members of the Council known for their careful diplomatic caution, reportedly stood during the session and asked a question that seemed to silence the room entirely. If this species can defeat the Thren on their very first true engagement, using technology only 18 months old, what exactly do we intend to do if they ever decide we are the threat instead? No one in that chamber apparently had a satisfying answer. I think what unsettled the Council most wasn't our weapons or our tactics, or even the speed at which we had prepared for a war. None of them believed we were capable of anticipating. What truly unsettled them was something harder to measure, something Grace had warned us about long before the first Thren ship ever crossed into our system. Humanity's psychology simply didn't match anything in their historical models. Most species who joined the Council arrived slowly, gradually shaped by contact with more advanced neighbors who gently guided them toward peaceful cooperation before they ever faced a serious military threat. These species learned caution before they learned conflict. They learned negotiation before they learned resistance. Earth learned differently. We spent our entire history before galactic contact locked in cycles of conflict and recovery, war and rebuilding, catastrophe and adaptation. By the time we finally reached the stars, we carried thousands of years of practiced resilience with us, a kind of stubborn determination that simply refused to accept defeat as a final answer. The Council's analysts, according to Ellen, spent days reviewing historical archives from Earth after the battle, trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed. They studied our conflicts, our recoveries, our habit of turning catastrophe into innovation faster than almost any other species in their recorded history. What they found disturbed them more than comforted them. A species that treated existential threats as motivation rather than paralysis. A species capable of reorganizing its entire industrial capacity within months when survival demanded it. A species too young to have learned the galaxy's unspoken rule, the quiet understanding shared among older civilizations that certain younger species should never be provoked before they fully understood their own limitations, because some of them never learned those limitations at all. Peter Lindquist, listening to a recording of parts of that council session weeks later, laughed quietly to himself, before saying something I still remember clearly. "They spent centuries teaching gentle species how to behave," he said. "Nobody ever taught us. We figured it out ourselves, the hard way, over and over again." The council ultimately decided against formal sanctions, largely because there was no legal precedent for punishing a species for successfully defending itself. But the diplomatic tone toward Earth changed noticeably in the weeks following the battle. Delegations that once treated our representatives with polite, distant curiosity began requesting private meetings instead. Trade offers that once moved slowly through bureaucratic channels suddenly accelerated. Species that had barely acknowledged Earth's existence before the invasion began sending careful, respectful communications, testing the waters of a relationship none of them fully understood yet. Grace explained it to me best, during a quiet conversation we had shortly after returning from patrol duty near the edge of the system. "They're not afraid of our weapons," she said. "They're afraid of what our weapons represent, a species that adapts faster than they can predict, a species that treats war as a temporary state instead of a final catastrophe. That's not something you can easily plan around." I thought about Ellen's words again, about how the entire council chamber had gone silent as they watched our fleet refuse to retreat. I thought about the Doran representative's question, still apparently unanswered weeks later. What exactly would the council do if humanity ever became the threat instead of the target? None of us wanted that future. Earth hadn't built its defense fleet to conquer anyone. We built it because history had taught us, painfully and repeatedly, that peace without strength rarely lasts long against those willing to test it. But the rest of the galaxy didn't fully understand that distinction yet, and I suspected it would take years, maybe decades, before humanity's true intentions were trusted the way other long-standing council members trusted each other. For now, all we could do was continue rebuilding, continue strengthening our defenses, and continue proving through actions rather than words that Earth wanted a place among the stars, built on cooperation, not conquest. Whether the rest of the galaxy believed that yet was another matter entirely. 3 weeks after the battle, I stood on the observation deck of the Meridian, looking down at Earth through the reinforced glass, watching sunlight spread slowly across the Pacific as the planet turned beneath us. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Blue oceans, scattered clouds, the familiar outline of continents I had memorized as a child staring at classroom globes long before I ever imagined commanding a warship in defense of that same small planet. From up here, nothing about Earth suggested it had just survived the opening move of an interstellar invasion. Daniel joined me quietly, standing beside me without saying anything for a while, the two of us simply watching the planet turn in comfortable silence. "Command wants us back at the shipyards within the hour," he finally said. "New orders came through this morning." "Let me guess," I said. "More construction." "More construction," he confirmed. Grace's team submitted an expanded defense proposal. Command approved it almost immediately. I wasn't surprised. Grace had spent months warning us that the Thren wouldn't be the last threat Earth faced, and after the battle we had just survived, no one in command was willing to take chances with our future safety. "Any word from the council?" I asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "A formal statement went out this morning. Official diplomatic channel. I think you'll want to read it yourself." He handed me a small data tablet, and I scrolled through the translated council statement carefully, reading each line more than once, trying to understand exactly what tone the message was meant to carry. The statement acknowledged Earth's successful defense against an unprovoked attack. It confirmed that the Thren Ascendancy would face formal review for violating Council protocols regarding unauthorized military action against a member species. It also included, almost as an afterthought near the end, a quiet request for expanded diplomatic dialogue between Earth and several previously distant Council delegations. "They want to talk to us now," I said, more to myself than to Daniel. "They want to understand us now," Daniel corrected gently. "There's a difference." He was right, of course. Ellen Marsh had told me something similar during our last conversation, describing how quickly attitudes across the Council had shifted once delegates realized humanity wasn't the fragile, disorganized species their early reports had suggested. Earth sent its own response later that week, carefully worded by our diplomatic team with input from military command, myself included. I remembered helping draft one particular line, insisting it remain exactly as written, despite some hesitation from a few of the more cautious voices in the room. Humanity did not seek this conflict, and we take no pride in the losses suffered by either side, but we will always defend our home fully and completely against any threat that comes to our door, without hesitation and without exception. It wasn't meant as a challenge. It was simply meant as truth, stated plainly, the way Grace had always believed important things should be communicated. In the weeks that followed, everything about Earth's relationship with the wider galaxy began shifting in small but meaningful ways. Trade agreements that once moved slowly through cautious negotiation suddenly progressed with unusual speed. Scientific exchange programs, previously limited to modest cultural curiosities, expanded to include deeper technological cooperation. Diplomats from species we had barely interacted with before the battle began, requesting formal visits to Earth, eager to understand more about the small, unpredictable species that had driven back an experienced invasion fleet during its very first true military engagement. Grace remained cautious throughout all of it, reminding us often that respect, earned through strength, could just as easily turn into fear, and fear had a way of becoming its own kind of danger if left unmanaged. "They don't fully trust us yet," she said one evening, as several of us gathered in the same briefing room where our defense preparations had first begun 18 months earlier. "They respect what we did. They're not sure yet what kind of species we truly are underneath that." Peter Lindquist, sitting nearby with a cup of coffee he had barely touched, shrugged in his usual relaxed manner. "Then we show them, slowly, over time. Actions carry more weight than any statement we could ever send." I agreed with him, though I also understood Grace's deeper concern. Humanity had proven, decisively and publicly, that it could not be easily conquered. But proving strength was never the hardest part of building trust among the stars. The harder part would be proving restraint, showing the wider galaxy that our strength existed to protect, not to expand at the expense of others. Months later, standing once again on that same observation deck, I watched a new class of Earth-built vessels take shape near the lunar shipyards, larger and more advanced than anything we had built before the invasion, incorporating lessons learned from both our victory and the quiet vulnerabilities that battle had exposed. Grace's expanded defense proposal had already reshaped much of our approach to galactic security, blending careful diplomacy with continued military preparation, refusing to let either strength or caution outweigh the other. Ellen visited Earth personally around that time, part of an official council delegation eager to understand humanity more directly rather than through second-hand reports and translated statements. We spoke privately during one of her visits, standing near the same shipyards where our defense fleet had first been built, in near total secrecy, less than 2 years earlier. "You know," she said, watching construction crews move efficiently between half-finished starship frames, "some delegates still don't know what to make of your species. You're aggressive when threatened, but patient when respected, dangerous, but not cruel. It's a combination our historical models never accounted for." Maybe your models were built on the wrong assumption, I said. Maybe not every species needs centuries of guidance to understand the difference between necessary strength and unnecessary conquest. She studied me for a long moment before smiling slightly. Maybe you're right. Or maybe humanity is simply a variable the galaxy hasn't finished calculating yet. I thought about that phrase often in the months that followed. Humanity as an unfinished calculation, a species still writing its own definition, even as the rest of the galaxy tried to understand what that definition might eventually become. Grace continued expanding our defense capabilities, always careful to balance growth with restraint, aware that unchecked military expansion could easily be misread by a galaxy still uncertain about our true intentions. Daniel took command of a newly constructed vessel shortly after, one of several new ships built specifically to patrol Earth's expanding diplomatic and trade routes rather than simply defend our home system. As for me, I remained aboard the Meridian, watching Earth's place among the stars slowly shift from cautious tolerance toward something closer to genuine respect, built not through conquest, but through the simple, undeniable proof that humanity would always defend what mattered most, without hesitation, without apology, and without ever needing permission from anyone else to do so. Standing once more on that quiet observation deck, watching Earth turn peacefully below me, I found myself thinking about everything that had changed since those first terrifying alarms tore through the silence of the Meridian's bridge. We hadn't asked to be feared. We hadn't sought conflict, or conquest, or recognition through violence. We had simply refused to be anyone's easy target, and in doing so, we had forced an entire galaxy to reconsider everything it thought it understood about the newest, smallest, and most unpredictable species now sitting quietly among the stars. Somewhere beyond the edges of our solar system, I knew other species were watching Earth more closely than ever before, no longer out of simple curiosity, but out of a growing, quiet understanding that whatever humanity truly was, it was not something the galaxy could afford to underestimate again. And as Earth continued turning peacefully beneath me, blue and calm and unaware of just how much the wider universe had begun to change its opinion of us, I couldn't help but wonder what challenges still waited for us further out among the stars, and whether humanity, true to its own restless nature, would ever truly be content simply defending what it already had. Something told me that quiet chapter of our story was only just beginning.